Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for today's MDICx webinar. We're really excited to present this topic on CDRH, an update on CDRH patient-centered initiatives. I want to thank you all for joining us, and thank you all for being the first to attend a webinar with our new webinar platform. But we'll largely follow the same rules that we always have, and that is if you have questions for any of our panelists, please enter them either through the chat box or through the Q&A box. We're reserving the last 15 minutes or so for questions for our panel. We have a terrific panel of speakers today. We have 3 speakers from CDRH who are going to give us an update on a number of initiatives going on within CDRH on striving to partner with patients within the agency. Katie O'Callaghan, Annie Saha, and Michelle Tarver will be giving updates on CDRH's patient-centered initiatives, both with some accomplishments from the past year and what they're looking to do going forward. And we also have with us today Kim McCleary, who's been a longtime partner in MDIC's Science of Patient Input initiative, who's speaking today on behalf of the AWAKE Sleep Apnea initiative. They are hosting a unique event later in June where they'll be bringing in folks from both CDER and CDRH to really focus on patient needs in this important therapeutic area. So with that, I will turn it over to Katie to start us off on our updates on CDRH initiatives. Katie?
Great, thank you, Stephanie and MDIC for the kind invitation, and thank you all for participating. My name is Katie O'Callaghan. I serve as the CDRH Assistant Director for Strategic Programs, and I have the pleasure and honor of overseeing a really talented and creative group of individuals who come from a diverse set of backgrounds, including clinical, legal, scientific research, engineering, business, education, and more. And together, we're responsible for developing, managing, and coordinating a number of strategic programs and partnerships for CDRH, including our ongoing relationship with MDIC and those collaborations. I have with me here today 2 key folks from my group, Annie Saha and Michelle Tarver. And each of them leads a team that plays a key role in directing, coordinating, and implementing our Partner with Patients strategic priority initiatives and related MDUFA IV commitments related to patient science and engagement, which we will tell you more about. Next slide, please. Oh, am I controlling it?
You should have control, Katie.
It doesn't seem to be advancing.
There you go.
Okay, just a bit of delayed reaction. All right, so here's our outline for the FDA portion. I'll provide some overview about our vision and the context and drivers for change. I'll turn it over to Annie to talk about our progress to date, and I'll wrap up with some focus areas for potential future collaboration. So CDRH is a really dynamic and exciting place to work at FDA. It's the center that oversees devices in radiologic health, and the challenge that our employees face is staying on top of the cutting edge of science and technology for over 5,000 different types of medical technology and devices. And dealing with a very complex and evolving, always evolving regulatory and technical and business landscape. And so with all of these challenges, it's really critical that we keep our focus on the patient at the heart of all that we do. And our vision statement reflects that, and it puts patients first, that patients in the U.S. will have access to high-quality, safe, and effective medical devices of public health importance first in the world. In our ecosystem, there are some very hot trends that are reshaping our entire landscape. One of them is the promise of real-world evidence, and of course, MDIC is playing a central role in this through the NEST Coordinating Center. And the opportunities that exist is we better are able to access and utilize real-world evidence in our decisions can really be brought to bear in terms of patient-centric evidence as well as insight. Another key trend is the digitization and digital health opportunities that come from our expanding capabilities in computing power, sensors, connectivity, and software that really has provided an enabling force to no longer be limited to looking through a tiny peephole of a discrete office visit, but really allows us to zoom out and look at patient experience across the entire healthcare continuum and throughout the cycle of their daily lives. The challenge, though, that comes as we gain greater access to ever more amounts of information is how do we sort the signal from the noise? And many people believe that it's through the application of a patient-centered focus that we will be able to really yield the fruits of these big data opportunities by finding insights that we're after. For medical devices, we recognize that safe and effective ongoing medical device use increasingly depends on patient engagement. This is for a number of reasons. Today, patients are more and more involved in shared decision-making, and the changing demographics in terms of chronic disease is playing a big role in this. By some estimates, over 100 million Americans are managing and living with chronic diseases today. So that's a really enormous portion of the population that needs to be fully engaged in the management of their conditions. We increasingly see medical devices being used in a home healthcare setting. And of course, patients are communicating and connecting to share information and experiences with other quote-unquote real-world patients. So patient engagement is clearly important in care delivery settings between interactions between clinicians and patients, but where does it fit in FDA's work? When FDA is evaluating a new technology or evaluating new information about the real-world performance of technology already on the market, we pull together teams of experts that are looking at all the data and evidence from a variety of sources, be it clinical data from trials or real-world sources, non-clinical data on testing, what we know about the marketplace. And this team of experts is looking into the data and the evidence and asking lots of questions. What do we know about the benefits? What do we know about the risks? Who is the target patient population? Do the benefits outweigh the risks in that patient population? And for the remaining risks, what mitigations can be put in place to really optimize that benefit risk profile? And by bringing patient perspective into that decision-making process, that really provides a lot of insight. It helps us to sort through, as I was mentioning on the landscape scale, it helps us to sort through all of the data and find the signal in the noise. And we believe that in a feedback loop mechanism, the work that FDA does to sort through all of this information and evidence and determine how to interpret it, that this work informs decisions back into the clinician-patient healthcare delivery space. So in recognition of these driving forces, CDRH leadership elected for the 2016 and 17 period to focus on partnering with patients in recognition that if we're to successfully achieve our mission and vision, we need to go beyond working simply in service on behalf of patients and find ways to interact with them as partners and work together to do our work. And we did this through a three-pronged strategy over the 2-year time period to establish the nest, a variety of activities on partner with patients that Annie will elaborate on in a moment, and a focus on quality and organizational excellence. The partner with patients priority included 2 broad goals with a number of associated initiatives. First, to promote a culture of meaningful patient engagement by facilitating CDRH interaction with patients. And number 2, to increase the use and transparency of patient input as evidence in our decision-making. Moving forward from today for the 2018 to 2020 period, the center is focusing on really making our vision a reality through enhancement and widespread application of some approaches that we've already started. And the measure of our success will be that by the end of this period, over half of manufacturers of nanotechnologies in the U.S. market will intend to bring their devices to the U.S. first or in parallel with other major markets. And our three-pronged strategy for this period is a focus on employee success, on removing barriers through simplicity, and on collaborative communities. I'll just highlight of those, the collaborative communities priority is one in which we really seek to expand and build upon the existing collaborations that we have, including, for example, those with MDIC. And what we envision here is that there'd be a concerted effort to establish and support fora where public and private sector members come together and work on shared problems and solutions in an environment of trust, respect, and where members share a collective responsibility to make progress. And to touch briefly on the Medical Device User Fee Act, the fourth iteration of that, which was signed into law, this reflects the commitment on the part of both industry and the FDA to build on the progress we've made together. And for the science, patient science and engagement arena, we have committed to advancing patient input and involvement in the regulatory process, leveraging public-private partnerships like MDIC and others where appropriate, to develop expertise and capacity for review and early consultation advice in patient-reported outcomes and patient preference information, to improve the regulatory predictability and impact of that work, and to open public dialogue on approaches for incorporating this information as evidence in device submissions and other ways of advancing patient engagement. And with that, I'll turn it over to Annie.
Thanks. I think you meant to advance the slides for me.
Sure thing.
So thanks, Kate. I think that's a great overview of where we are and where we're going. And I'm just take a step back and talk about the progress we've made specifically on our strategic priority efforts to partner with patients. And we really see this as a combination of both strengthening our culture, which is also a part of our strategic priorities, of both patient engagement and partnership, and really how do we build that capacity. I'll focus on a couple of different efforts. Our Patient Engagement Advisory Committee program, we're in the process of developing a patient care partner connection and a few other things to walk through. So the Patient Engagement Advisory Committee was created to really ensure that we are incorporating and ensuring that the patient needs and experiences are considered in our work, and to do this in a way that's a formal process where we can really get advice and consensus and different perspectives and recommendations to be provided to FDA. We held our inaugural meeting in October of 2017. There's a link to the meeting materials there in the blue, and the topic was really about patient engagement and medical device clinical trials. We focused in three different areas. How do you design patient-friendly clinical trials? How can we approach recruitment, enrollment, and retention for trials to ensure to keep patients involved? And ultimately, how do we disseminate those results to both the trial participants as well as other patients so that they understand and know what happened even if the trial may not have continued or was not a success, and certainly also if it was a success. And we are looking to schedule our next meeting in late fall of 2018. We're also in the process of establishing what we're calling the PNCC, or Patient Care Partner Connection. And this is really an idea of how do we facilitate FDA staff engagement with individual patients and care partners to really understand the specific patient experience of the disease states and how they're using devices both for their diagnosis and treatment. And some of the considerations we're looking at is how can FDA improve or remove barriers for patient interaction? What is effective engagement, and understand that? How should we partner with different organizations? And a real key interest area for us is how do we engage with underrepresented populations and not just the most activated patient groups who have the resources, ability to come to different meetings or to be able to live in the Washington, D.C. area. If you know folks who would be interested in being part of this, feel free to reach out to Ann Hammer, whose contact information is there at the end. And ultimately, this all feeds into how do we create this culture of patient engagement and partnership. And we sort of see this as, we've jokingly said, sort of like a dating process where you start with your interaction, your first date, if you will, and sort of feel things out. If you feel like things are going well, you're going to continue to date, you're going to, continue on in the process, and ultimately you're going to have some kind of meaningful engagement, and ultimately that may lead to a true partnership between the parties of how we can really work together in an optimal state. We're really at the two-way communication and dialogue, and it's not just FDA passing on information, not getting anything back, or vice versa. And that we really have seen that culture strengthened by having that meaningful engagement. And we've seen very positive feedback from the strategic priority efforts of having patient engagement, that really, that engagement was really positive, and that we've really built a lot of partnerships with patient organizations. And if you have groups or you're interested in partnering with us in the patient engagement space, Lisa Miller Noel is our lead for patient engagement for the center. Her email is actually on this slide and the next slide. So ultimately, from our strategic priority efforts, so how do we do? We set pretty high goals for ourselves, and we said that by the end of December 2017, that 90% of our employees would interact with patients as part of their job duties, and we exceeded that with 96% of staff interactions. We said we were going to create at least one or more new mechanisms for employees to obtain feedback and at least foster participation of 20 groups. And we were able to develop 37 on and off-site patient engagement opportunities for our center staff. We had 16 mechanisms for patient inputs that we piloted and had 48 patient groups participate in that. And ultimately, we really saw the ultimate proof is in the pudding, and that was what the staff comments are. We've got a couple here that we heard because we surveyed staff afterwards to ask them if this was meaningful or not. And really, we heard, steps are needed based on our human action, on our actions, and that hearing the patient's personal experience was incredibly powerful and moving, and truly was helpful and impactful on the job. And on the patient science side, we looked at how can we incorporate patient perspectives in our regulatory decision-making, and primarily that was focused on two prongs. One, in patient-reported outcomes, so those are the direct from patient information about, symptoms, how are they functioning, how's their psychological well-being, what's their quality of life, and hearing directly from the patients as to how they're feeling and doing. And then on the other prong, patient preference information, so understanding what patients value, what do they care about in terms of the most important outcomes, what do they care about in terms of the relative importance of those different outcomes, what are the trade-offs in terms of benefits and risks that patients are willing to accept. And we want to see, and part of our strategic priorities commitments were to increase that patient perspective in our regulatory decision-making. And so we saw on the patient-reported outcome side that we saw an increase of 75% of our approved pivotal investigational device trials actually included a patient-reported outcome. And on the patient preference side, we had an increase we started at a baseline of 1 in FY 2015, and throughout our strategic priority period, we had 6 industry-sponsored KPI studies that were submitted to CDRH. And ultimately, we also committed to being transparent in how we're using this. As Katie talked about in our MDUFA IV goals, we are ensuring that we are predictable and transparent in our process. So we committed that by the end of 2017, that we would include a public summary of whether any relevant patient perspective data was considered. We met that goal, and we are continuing to stay at 100% where all of our public summaries include whether or not there was patient perspective data considered. And ultimately, the regulatory impact, and we've seen this in the patient preference side, both in the obesity space as well as in home hemodialysis, where a company has submitted their patient preference study along with other information to allow us to expand an indication for solo home hemodialysis along with other risk mitigation strategies. And the patient preference information gave us that ability to really understand that patients were willing to accept those trade-offs. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Katie to talk about where we see potential future areas of collaboration.
Thank you, Annie. So I will start with the obvious, which would be the MDIC areas of activity that are already ongoing. Two that I'll point out here is a new initiative around patient input in clinical trial design. You can find more information here on the MDIC webpage under the Science of Patient Input. There you can also find additional resources, which is sort of one of the great repositories that we would recommend you take a look at for those of you who are interested in learning more about the patient-centered benefit-risk framework, as well as other information around patient preferences that is meant to be helpful as you're considering and preparing patient preference studies for potential regulatory or other uses. From an FDA perspective, we recognize, as Annie alluded to, that to really move the needle, we needed to find a way to elevate the patient input we were accustomed to seeing to the level of evidence. And so you are all probably familiar with our total product life cycle schematic here that depicts the process from idea through development and regulatory evaluation to market. What I'm highlighting here is areas where final guidance is already in place and implemented. Staff has been trained on how patient input can be used as evidence in areas that are under our regulatory purview. So a few to highlight would be in the clinical space for IDE, investigational device exemption submissions, which are where FDA evaluates the clinical study protocols. The benefit risk framework for how FDA evaluates those does include patient preference information. And then, of course, for patient-reported outcomes and other outcomes that matter most to patients, we encourage seeing those in those clinical study protocols. In the regulatory decision timeframe, both patient preferences and patient-reported outcomes are included in the marketing application benefit risk final guidance, as well as the worksheets that are used in implementing this guidance into our everyday decision-making. And finally, we have guidance that outlines the role of patient preference information in compliance benefit risk information, and the prior documents do touch on the potential use for patient preference or patient-reported outcomes as we assess new and expanded uses of technology that is already on the market. Another program we'd like to highlight is the Medical Device Development Tool Program, or MDDT. This program was conceived in part to bridge the innovations that were happening in the research space into the development and evaluation space, and really offers the opportunity to reduce regulatory burden by bringing the advances in science together from all of these parties. The regulatory impact of that program includes 2 tools that have been qualified. These are both patient-reported outcomes. The first to be qualified in October of last year was the Kansas City Cardiomyopathy Questionnaire, and then in March of this year, we qualified the Minnesota Living with Heart Failure Questionnaire. And if you go to our website under MDDT and click on these links, you will find a summary of the evidence and the basis for qualification that we evaluated, which outlines, importantly, the context for use within which we believe the evidence supports its use, and the efficiencies that are offered by using these qualified tools is that we really are able to minimize uncertainty, and sponsors can be assured that if they use these tools within the defined context of use, there will not be a need to reevaluate the evidence for each new use. Within that context of use, we're confident that we can rely on the data that is generated in clinical studies using these tools. Another accomplishment to highlight, which was really the beginning of a dialogue in the public sector, in the public sphere, is our workshop in December of last year, which was a really collaborative effort across all 3 medical product centers and our Centers for Excellence in Regulatory Science and Innovation, focused on patient preference, recognizing that in order to drive advances in the science and appropriate adoption, we need to continue to raise awareness, deepen understanding, and facilitate adoption through development of resources. And so you can see here how some of the content for that 2-day workshop helped us to achieve those objectives. The link in the title will take you to a place where you can find all of the recordings and slides. There's a lot of good information available there for anyone who's interested in learning more about patient preferences. I will give you the Cliff Notes though. There's one key takeaway. I would say it is this slide, which is a more detailed framework for how you can use this information in the regulatory space. This was developed with input from CDRH and our colleagues at the Center for Drugs and Biologics. And we recommend for any company or other party interested in bringing patient preference to the FDA that you begin with the end in mind and sit down with your stakeholders and discuss how do we want this information to be used. And that will really help us hone in on the critical factors for those studies to be of the quality that we need for those uses. For patient-reported outcomes, we issued a framework in December of last year on the value and use of PROs in medical devices. And two key content areas I'd like to highlight for this audience would be resources. So we have an example of a number of different types of PRO use. There are 5 demonstrative case studies and a compendium that accompanies the report with, to date, 135 publicly available uses of PROs in prior CDRH regulatory decisions. And then as we look to the future, we will be focusing in not just patient preferences, but PROs on building expertise and capacity, developing a fit-for-purpose evidence threshold framework for PRO validation, and developing models of bridging studies so we can adapt PROs more efficiently. A key excerpt from that report is pictured here and really highlights how ubiquitous PROs have become in device studies. As Annie mentioned, last fiscal year, 75% of our IDEs included PROs. And what you can see with the colored bars in the back is that all of our divisions do receive some volume. So this is really spread across different clinical and medical device subsectors. And this reflects what we believe is not just FDA's interest, but certainly the interest on the part of industry sponsors and other stakeholders in the value of the information that we get from the science and patient input studies from PROs, which can be used as endpoints, but are also of interest to payers, providers, patients, and other downstream decision makers, and patient preference information, which we highlighted the uses in the prior slide. So ultimately, through these and other related efforts, we believe that we can move closer to our shared goal, which is to improve patient health and quality of life by better understanding patients' needs, experiences, and preferences. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Katie and Annie. I'm going to take. Oh, there we go. Sorry, a little bit of a hiccup with the new system here. I'm going to give control over to our next speaker, Kim McCleary, who's going to tell us a little bit about an initiative that her group is leading coming up next week.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie, and thanks to MDIC and to colleagues Katie and Annie at CDRH. It has been such a real professional and personal pleasure to work with MDIC and with CDRH to really shape a lot of the ideas and the materials that Katie and Annie just presented, and to be part of the MDIC work on really digging into the science of patient input through initially the patient preference work and now a much broader array of activities. So it's also fun now to share with the group here today kind of a case example of how in one therapeutic area we're bringing some of the vehicles together from across the FDA that have been used over the last 5 years to really help bring patient perspectives more close to regulatory decision makers, and to also empower patient communities to better understand their role or potential role in shaping areas of unmet medical need, and in terms of highlighting those, in terms of bringing forward some of the clinically meaningful outcomes that are most important to them, and ultimately in terms of being more empowered in terms of their own health to make better use of products that are coming through the pipeline and already available in the marketplace. So the case study that I have to present today is in the therapeutic area of sleep apnea. And if we think of sleep apnea as a very prevalent condition, it affects about 18 million Americans. Its diagnosis involves both a very thorough kind of clinical assessment and in some cases family history, but certainly a number of medical devices from clinic-based polysomnography to home-based polysomnography to understand the sleep architecture, sometimes EEGs, sometimes EKGs to rule out other things, all of which are regulated by CDRH. And then the treatment of sleep apnea actually is multifactorial also with positive airway pressure devices being kind of the centerpiece of sleep apnea therapy, and a number of different companies in that space providing the CPAP and APAP and BiPAP machines, the masks, the renewable supplies that the patients have to use, using the data coming out of those machines to kind of fine-tune how they're being used. Many of the patients are also taking medications to regulate sleep and daytime sleepiness and to promote wakefulness during the day, and to treat the highly complicated, often comorbid conditions that either may come before or after or as a component of their sleep apnea. So for me, it's been a real interesting journey to learn more about this condition and then to put it in the setting of patient-focused medical product development. So that's what I'm going to share with you today. Hopefully I can get the slides to go. See if I'm as successful. Katie and Annie were. There we go. So Katie and Annie did a really terrific job of talking about how CDRH has really pioneered a lot of the work in this period or era of expanded opportunity for patient input into regulatory decision-making. Just to kind of complement that, I wanted to just give a little bit of background on what has been happening on the drugs side of FDA with the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, really coming out of a law that was passed in 2012, the FDASIA, Food and Drug Safety and Innovation Act, and MDUFA V at that time. There was a commitment made by the agency to hold a series of 20 meetings on different medical conditions to look at ways that patient perspectives could be highlighted for the benefit of regulatory decision-making. And kind of as a related but separate work stream was the agreement by the agency to take a more structured approach to its benefit risk assessment. And these two work streams kind of have played off one another in terms of the benefit risk assessment being a key area of focus for what patients could help regulators to understand. And I think that's carried across both CDER and CDRH. So let's see. Oh, let me go back one. So the patient-focused drug development meetings that were part of this 2012 package of commitments were really undefined in the law. They gave the agency and the community kind of a lot of latitude to figure out what that would be. And I was part of the group that really helped CDER think through what did it want to accomplish in these 20 meetings, what would the appropriate format look like, how could they make the best use of time, would they be half-day meetings or full-day meetings? I mean, really it was kind of a blank slate when we first started out, and no one knew quite what to expect. I was involved in helping two of the first 4 meetings prepare for the meeting, the first one being on chronic fatigue syndrome, myalgic encephalomyelitis, And then I also assisted the narcolepsy community that was the first of the rare diseases in this series of 20 that ultimately became 24 meetings. And now there have been a couple in addition to the original commitment. And the format that has become pretty well established at this point really focuses in a few key areas. First, the symptoms and daily impacts of the disease and conditions, so that those are illuminated from the patient perspective. The next bucket, if you will, is around treatments and other approaches that patients are using. And I think what's been particularly interesting about this is that I think it's really brought to light how many different things patients use in order to address their symptoms and live as full and functional a life as possible, that it goes well beyond things that are indicated for their condition. There's a lot of symptomatic relief, a lot of over-the-counter, a lot of complementary medicine, a lot of supportive strategies, and lifestyle management that go into almost all of the conditions that have been featured in this series. And I think that has been a real learning opportunity for all of us who have participated. I think that most of the meetings have shown that there are a wide range of patient journeys and experiences that are influenced by a number of different factors, both before the condition may present itself and even following if there are issues of survivorship. And I think meetings have proven themselves to be so useful that after the initial commitment was ended or was completed in 2017, FDA created a new vehicle called the externally led meetings so that this series could extend but relieve the burden on planning and hosting these meetings from the FDA and kind of move it into more of a community-based model. So we have a new vehicle called externally led meetings, and there have been about 12 or 14 of those so far. So a total of 40 meetings held to date. And most of those have followed pretty faithfully the same template that FDA used. A couple have diverted because of the nature of the condition or the different regulatory issues that were really immediate. But for the most part, they have followed this pretty well-carved template. So the meeting that's coming up next Friday on sleep apnea is one of these externally led meetings. There is an application process for anybody who's listening in who may wonder, how do you go about planning one of these? There's a quarterly review process. So the American Sleep Apnea Association, which is a patient-led organization, applied to FDA in November of 2017. They were granted approval to hold this meeting in February 2018. And as part of their application, they highlighted the fact that sleep apnea is treated with a variety of different approaches, including medical devices and medications. And they explicitly requested that at their meeting, they could involve both CDER and CDRH. And CDRH, of course, has participated in some of the other meetings on Parkinson's disease and other conditions where supplemental oxygen is a big component of treatment. But this was a first opportunity to sort of brand and identify this as going beyond a patient-focused drug development meeting to really make it more of a patient-focused medical product development meeting. And so it's been exciting to be part of that process. So we will host this meeting. The American Sleep Apnea Association will host the meeting on Friday, June 8th, proximate to the FDA campus at the College Park Marriott. And notably, it immediately follows the annual sleep scientific meeting that's happening beginning on Saturday in Baltimore. So we've picked up a number of people who were already sort of in the DC area for that meeting. And we're delighted that Katie O'Callaghan will provide closing comments at that meeting and share some of the information she provided today. What's important to note about these meetings is that they kind of go beyond the number of people that might come to either an FDA-hosted meeting or an externally hosted meeting on a single day in the DC area. That many of the meetings have been webcast. All of the ones hosted by FDA have certainly been webcast, and most of the externally led meetings have been webcast. So if you think of this in terms of concentric circles, you have a number of opportunities for patients to participate live in person, and some subset of those will be selected as panelists to kind of highlight their stories and kick off a broader discussion. So at the next Friday's meeting, we'll have 10 of those panelists that are patients selected from the group of volunteers that self-identified. We'll have about 100 people on site participating in sort of an Oprah-esque conversation about each of those different dimensions of the patient journey. And then on the webcast, we'll have hundreds of people. I think we're up to about 400 people by webcast that have registered in advance. And then we have also conducted over the last several weeks, for about the last 6 weeks, a patient-based survey, and we're up to just over 4,000, closing in on 5,000 survey responses. So that gives us a really much wider exposure to all of the different varieties of patient experience that are out there beyond just those individuals who might be equipped and capable of getting themselves to the DC area on a single day, in the busy month of June. And you can see from this survey, it's a 31 question survey. It mirrors the types of questions that have been asked at the previous, 40 or so patient-focused drug development meetings. And we're using that information that we've gathered from these 4,000 plus patients to really shape some polling questions that will be asked live of the people in the room and also watching by webcast. They'll help us chip into areas where the answers are either a little unclear, or there was a wide variety of opinion, or things that came out through the open text answers that maybe weren't strong enough in our minds at the outset to warrant their own question, but that we want to understand better. And so it's been a really valuable tool in planning the meeting. I think it will also be a very valuable tool after the meeting, both to the research community and to FDA. Get this to go. Whoops, one too far. You can see this is just one of the questions that we were asked by FDA to, in addition to the range of treatments that patients are using, to focus in on what some of the barriers are to adherence. And I think there, is a lot of concern about adherence to CPAP therapy in particular. But what we heard back from patients about the barriers that they have in getting the best treatment that they might benefit from is just a wide range of things, from access to appropriate professionals, access to the sleep clinic testing that they may need in order to kind of gateway them into insurance coverage for the therapies, that the equipment that they have often takes many trial and error sessions with the DME staff to find the right combination of the machine and the masks and all of the other accessories that go with it, and that there are a lot of barriers, as we know, in terms of coverage and payment. So it's turned out to be a much wider array of topics than we had initially anticipated, and I think will give us a rich discussion next Friday. One other area that we have been really, impressed by the range of answers is just leaving kind of the last question open to respondents about what else they'd like us to know about their experience. And what comes through is just the multidimensional nature of the condition and the experience of having it on relationships, on stigma, on being kind of the butt of jokes, of the dangers associated with not having known they were going to have it, that this was a clinical issue in their life, and near-death car accidents because they fell asleep at the wheel, just all kinds of things that have come out in the survey, and particularly through this last question when you give people the chance to offer their experience. So what we plan to do following the meeting is to take everything that we have collected, both at the meeting in terms of the rich discussion that we anticipate having, both through the panels and the group discussion, all of the survey results, the polling results, and we will produce a comprehensive report that will be released to the public and also submitted to the FDA. And there is now an archive on the FDA's website of all of the kind of externally collected patient experience data, and a place where that lives in sort of an evergreen fashion as a resource to those who might be interested in it. So we intend to have that out and available later this summer as a kind of faithful collection of what we have learned and benefited from the patient community. And if anyone is interested in participating, the meeting, as I said, will be next Friday from 10 to 4 at the College Park Marriott. And the webcast is also available live, and you can go to awakesleepapnea.org to register. And I'll stop there and turn it back to Stephanie.
Great, thanks, Kim. Well, at this point, I'd like to open it up the floor to questions. And we actually do have a first question that has come in. I'll remind all of you who are listening, you can submit questions either through the Q&A box or the chat box. Our first question for the FDA, does FDA anticipate their efforts with the culture of patient engagement will impact the regulatory review of devices? These interactions are anecdotal but clearly meaningful. What is the anticipated impact on the review process?
Hi, this is Katie. Thanks for the question. I think that the impact first and foremost has been on the review staff, as well as hopefully on the patients that participated. We heard from many of the staff who participated that these interactions really help them to gain a better understanding of the context in terms of the impact of the disease, the condition, the sometimes diagnostic odyssey, as they say, that patients go through, and then the impacts of various treatment options, be they medical devices or other options that patients have experienced. So the patient engagement focus during the strategic priorities was primarily on broadening and deepening that understanding that our staff have of the impact on patients. Certainly our staff bring a rich and deep expertise on the science and the technology and the medicine, and we think that this has really helped to round out that view with a focus on the sort of human perspective and impact of our work. As we move forward into the MDUFA commitments, we do have some specific focused areas of activity around training, as well as some policy development that will unfold over the 5-year MDUFA period, with plenty of opportunity for public input. And those are areas where we would expect to see much more direct impact on the review process.
Great, thanks, Katie. Another question for our FDA partners. Please tell us about how patient input will be gathered and used in assessing software as medical device tools. I believe that's what the SAMD acronym is, correct? The pre-cert program, the comment is that the pre-cert program seems to be silent on this topic.
So
Yeah, I'll just make a brief comment and pass it to Annie. It remains to be seen. There's certainly a lot of opportunities here. There are a lot of sort of technical and regulatory details that are being worked out first with regard to the pre-cert program that's being envisioned. But certainly there are plenty of opportunities, and I think anyone who has a particular interest in that area, please do feel free to either follow up with us or reach out through the various FDA feedback mechanisms around these digital health initiatives to learn more or get involved.
And we are actually partnering with our colleagues in the digital health program about how to best incorporate patient input in a way that's going to get relevant input instead of just sending out wonky technical software details in a way to really work together. And ultimately, the pre-certification group really does want to ensure that they're getting feedback from all stakeholders, including patients. So that will certainly be part of the overall efforts for the pre-cert program. And as Katie said, feel free to follow up directly if you have comments. I know there's a CDRH digital health mailbox, which is the most direct place to go for comments specifically on the pre-cert program.
Great, thank you. I'm wondering if you can maybe tell us a little bit about how CDRH works with other centers within FDA on some of these patient-centered initiatives. I know we're excited to have the meeting that Kim and the AWAKE Sleep Apnea group are hosting next week. We're excited to have representation from both CDER and CDRH. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you all are working together within the agency?
Sure. We have a very rich and open collaborative internal forum across the medical product centers where we share our lessons learned, our ideas, and look for opportunities for collaboration. There are, of course, differences in our regulatory framework, which necessitate different approaches. And there are also differences in our workforce and in some of the challenges that are front of mind for the different medical product areas. And so that's reflected in what you see in terms of the areas of difference. In terms of what's in common, I think, there's certainly an agency-wide, even beyond the medical product centers, an agency-wide interest in patient engagement and patient involvement in the regulatory process. And we, in the patient science arena, are certainly looking for ways to harmonize where appropriate with our colleagues at CDER and CBER.
Great, thank you. Kim, what advice would you have for patient groups that are interested in thinking about one of these patient-focused medical product meetings?
So I would kind of echo a slide that we saw earlier that begins with the phrase, begin with the end in mind. I've talked with a number of patient groups who are thinking about doing one of these meetings. Some of them, they think it's just like the next thing to do and they don't have a clear objective in mind. They haven't ever been to one, but they hear a lot about them. So I think there's an opportunity to first become informed and understand, what are the types of regulatory opportunities in the therapeutic area where your organization is vested, and understanding a bit about the landscape of, are there PROs in development? Are there clinical trial design issues that could be informed, that are informed by patient perspectives? Are the benefits and the risks well understood for products that may be in the pipeline, and how could those be informed by patient perspectives? These meetings, you think about putting on a one-day meeting as not being too heavy a lift, but they really, I think, done well, do require a fair amount of planning and preparation, and it's not for the faint of heart to do the kind of outreach to really make sure that you've got a broad representative pool of individuals coming together on a given date. And I think what many of us who've been kind of on the front lines of patient advocacy for a long time are seeing a shift away from reliance on kind of the poster child, if you will, single patient perspective, and a real interest in what are the range of experiences that people have, and understanding not just the average, but the tails on either side of that, kind of common, maybe best case scenario. So I think to make sure that you've got that breadth and depth of experience, it does take some planning, and it also takes, as Katie and Annie were talking about, time to kind of build the relationship with the agency and make sure that you have their needs in mind, and not just, bringing your community together in this particular setting. There are other ways to do that, patient conferences and scientific meetings. And if the challenges are not really at the regulatory decision-making point, I think there may be better vehicles to accomplish other goals than this one. So I would, very much a sort of fit for purpose approach to thinking about how this might be useful to accelerate the treatment options available to patients. And I'd be happy for Annie and Katie to take issue with anything I just said.
No issue here.
Great, thanks, Kim. We have a specific question about a specific therapeutic area here. How could folks find information on devices that are in development for autism patients, or is there a mechanism for finding about products in development?
Not through the FDA. We certainly are not permitted to discuss the nature of anything that's in development that's not public. Perhaps if there are patient organizations focused on autism that have an interest in this particular technology space, they may have some information through their website.
Yeah, I would echo that last suggestion. Many of the patient organizations do track the publicly announced development of medical therapies across all different types of things, including cell-based and gene therapies that are now starting to go into clinical trials as announcements are made, and they can be a real rich source of information about what's maybe near term and what's longer range.
Great, thank you. Well, I want to point out a couple of resources that we have up on the screen. In particular, the resources page, we have some information that's been gathered over the last couple of years that MDIC has been working in the science of patient input space. And in particular, if you have interest in patient preference studies, we have some great resources from our friends at CDRH on how to get started on those studies, and some key considerations to think about as you get started in those projects. The slides from today's webinar and the video will be posted in the coming days on MDIC's website, and I will send an email to everyone who is registered when that's available. Otherwise, I don't see any additional questions coming in, so I want to thank our panelists for joining us today, and thank you all for joining us. We have another webinar coming up next week on MDIC's Kids for Quality initiative, and you can always find out more about future webinars on our website and through our social media accounts. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks, Katie and Annie.
Thank you for the opportunity to participate.